I'm Debbi Dach-Sugarman, and I am the daughter of Morris Dash, D-A-C-H, and my dad was a survivor of the Birkenau and Auschwitz concentration camps. This is my best friend, Sandy Hackman, who is also the child of survivors. And the Holocaust was the systemic murder of 6 million Jews and over 5 million others. LGBTQ, Romas, disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, righteous Christians, anybody that Hitler deemed unnecessary to live was murdered. So over 11 million people were murdered, during this year period of time. Wiped out most of the population of European Jews, which is why it was so significant to our group of people. 1.5 million children, innocent children that did nothing. What could they have done? Were murdered. So my dad, Morris, he was the youngest. He had 3 older brothers, and he had parents, and he had uncles and aunts, and the 3 brothers, and they were married, and they had children. My dad was the only survivor from the entire family. And so he grew up in Plonsk, Poland. Plonsk was a suburb of Warsaw. It was about 45 minutes outside of Warsaw. And my grandfather was in the cattle business. My grandmother was a homemaker. They were Orthodox Jews. They were very religious, very pious. Their religion was everything to them. There were 2 synagogues that were both Orthodox in Plonsk, and Plonsk had a Jewish community from the 1500s on. So they had been around for a long time, and depending on what I have read, there were anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 Jews that lived in Plonsk. And my dad went to school. He went to the religious school in one of the synagogues. And, every day he would walk to school with his friends. And, as things started to heat up with the Germans and Hitler was coming to power, and then the Polish people took a turn and didn't like the Jews either. So he'd be going to school and they'd be screaming, "Dirty Jew, dirty Jew," and they'd be throwing rocks and they'd be hitting them with tree branches, and they'd be bloodied by the time they got to the synagogue to learn. And this went on day in and day out. And one day my father came home and he was crying, and my grandfather Laser said to him, "I'm going to give you something to cry about if you don't go out and defend yourself. You have to fight back." My dad was a lot younger than his other brothers too, so they were not attending school with him. They were already married with kids. So I think that was maybe a turning point, and my father kept that in the back of his mind, and it helped him survive. So things were really heating up with Hitler in Germany. And there was a lot of talk about what was going to come and that he was going to kill Jews. And my dad and his oldest brother went to Warsaw. And there was this fellow, Jabotinsky, and he was speaking there. And he said, "All the Jews need to get out. You have to leave Poland. You have to get out of here. Why? You're all going to be killed." So you would think people could just get on get in a car, which they didn't have. They had horses and buggies, or get on a train, but there was no way to leave. Hitler told people to get out of Europe, leave Eastern Europe. No countries would take them. They would stand in line waiting to try to get a visa, to try to get passports to go to other countries, to go to France, to go to the United States, to go to Germany, which was another hot point, but anywhere. But nobody would take us. Everybody just said, you're going to stay where you are. So very few people could get a passport and a visa and get out. Some got out right before the war, but it was so difficult. They stood in line for days and days and days, and you just couldn't leave. So Hitler came to power, came in, took Poland. You know, in less than 2 weeks, Poland fell, because Hitler had tanks, and Hitler had planes, and Hitler had guns, and the Polish army was on horses with sticks and stones, basically. There was no way for them to defend, so it fell. So the first thing that happened was they started to take away the businesses from the Jews. So the tailor shops, nope, couldn't have your shop. So, you know, they would throw rocks through the windows, they'd make you close your shop. They were taking away anybody's way to earn a living. And then they put the star on you. So the Jews had a yellow star. Some of them only had stars on the front. My dad said in Plonsk they had a star on the front and the back because the Nazis wanted to know if coming and going who you were. If you were LGBTQ community, you had a pink star. The developmentally disabled had a blue star, so they knew who everybody was, and they could single you out. And they would single people out, like the rabbis. The rabbis had these long beards. And one day my dad said in the square, the Germans knocked the rabbi down to the ground from his synagogue and took a knife and just slashed off his beard. And, you know, he was bleeding. Anything to humiliate people is what they did. And it just got worse and worse. And one day they came with a truck, and they took the young people out to fields outside of Plonsk, and my dad was one of them that went in this truck. And they had to dig a long, narrow ditch, and then they brought people from Plonsk there, and they told my dad and all the people that dug the ditch to walk away and turn their backs. They shot the people into the ditch. They didn't want to waste a bullet. They didn't kill most of the people. Knocked them into the ditch, and my dad and all of these people from Plonsk had to bury these people alive. He said he'll never forget that the earth was moving, and they were looking up, and the German soldiers were like, we're not going to waste a bullet. You're going to all die anyways. So think of that kind of inhumanity. This went on and on. He didn't do this just once. Went on and on. They would bring people from the suburbs of Plonsk, and then they desecrated the Jewish cemetery, and they took the headstones and all, and they had to pave the roads so the Germans could get in and out, and they used the stones. And finally they took them and they put everybody in the ghetto. So the ghetto was not the great end of town. And they took the people that were living on that end of town, moved them into the homes where my father and his family and all the other Jews lived, moved those people into the ghetto. They surrounded it with barbed wire. You could have several families living in one room. Okay, so Poland, the 30s, no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing. I mean, very, very, very primitive. So you crowd like 10, 12 people into one room, and they're all supposed to live like that. and you get disease. You get tuberculosis, you get typhus, you get lice, and the lice carried the disease, and people were dying left and right, which is exactly what Hitler wanted. This was the beginning of the final solution. And every morning they had to carry the people out that had died during the night and put them on carts, and then the carts would go into these killing fields, or burning fields, and there'd be ditches, and they'd burn the people because they didn't know how to dispose of the bodies. There were too many of them. And they would put people in gas vans and they'd drive them around. This is before the concentration camps were open, and the carbon monoxide would be pumped back in, and so they would be murdered that way and then again burned. And so this went on for years. So my father had no fear. He was like my height, but he was a big guy. And he just never his whole life had any fear. And so if you were caught outside of the ghetto, they'd kill you. He'd take a star off, he'd go out. I mean, they had no wood, they had no coal, they were cold. Poland is really cold. And they were freezing, and he would go out and he would get food, and he would get some coal or some wood, and he'd try to make his family more comfortable, and he'd barter. Well, my grandparents were, again, Orthodox, very, very, very pious Jews. They died for their religion. And they wouldn't eat anything my father brought because there are certain laws of kosher, and they weren't certain that what my dad brought in as food was kosher, so they would rather die than eat the food. So they would not eat anything. So, every day you just saw death and more fighting, and you'd be walking in the ghetto, and the Germans would just shoot people, just to shoot them. There were gallows hanging right in the center of town, and they would just hang people. People would be hanging from the gallows, and anything to humiliate you, to make you feel less than, is what the Germans did, and the Poles in the town followed with them. There were some righteous Polish people, though. My dad had a nephew, his name was Label, and he was like 4 years old from what I could gather. And a Polish farmer wanted to take him and hide him. He had blonde hair, curly, blue eyes, beautiful child. My aunt wouldn't let him go, so he was not saved. But some people were hidden, and some, like my dad had a friend from Winnipeg, and she was a beautiful girl, and they took her to be a maid at a Pole's house, and that's how she survived the war. Some people were sent to convents and were hidden there by the nuns. I mean, they were very lucky, but when they came back, there was nobody there waiting for them. So eventually, Hitler was building all of these camps, concentration camps, death camps, work camps, coal mines, slave labor. If you lived in a city that had train tracks, you would be put on a train and you would be deported to one of these camps. Sandy's family lived in a town where they had no train. So in her town, they took the people and they put them in the gas vans, and they drove them around and murdered them like that. There were killing fields where they just shot them, and that's how some of her family That's how they were murdered. My dad, Plonsk had a railroad track and a train station, and so they were deported to death camps. So the first group of 2,000 left Plonsk, and it was October of 42. And my grandparents, it was called the elderly and the developmentally disabled, went out on the first group, and my grandparents were on that group. And you know, when I think about them being the elderly, they were so much younger than I am now. And my dad and his 3 older brothers walked them to the train station, and they had a blanket, and my dad handed my grandmother, Devorah, the blanket, and she handed it back to him and said, "Where I'm going, I don't need this. You need this." And she told my dad he was going to be the only one that survived. And so they were deported, and they took a 3-day ride. Now, this was no luxury train. This was a cattle car, a wooden cattle car. There were no seats. The people were just packed in, standing, and their belongings were with them. They could each take 1 suitcase. And in the car was 1 bucket for human waste and 1 bucket of water. And it was a 3-day trip. So when they got there, I mean, obviously the old people, the developmentally disabled, they went right to the gas chambers. And they were gassed, and then they were burned in the crematoriums. There were 4 transports out of Plonsk in 6 weeks. My dad and his brother, that was 4 years older than him, were on the last transport out. They were taken to Birkenau. They got off the train at the platform, and when they opened the doors of the train, Dad said half of the train was dead just from the trip. I mean, they couldn't survive the trip. No food, no water, no sanitation. The Germans were standing there, and they had the German Shepherds and the Dobermans, and they're screaming, "Raus, raus, raus," you know, "hurry up, get out of the train." So they had to get out. They had to unload the bodies and pile them up. They had to unload the suitcases, and then they were put in a line for selection. And out of the 2,000 that arrived with my dad, 500 were sent to work, and the other 1,500 were sent to the gas chambers. So when they went to the gas chambers, what they did was they told people, "Here's a bar of soap, you're gonna go take a shower." Well, you know, 3 days of being in a train, that sounded like a really good deal. I mean, they felt horrible. They were going to get to clean. They were going to get to change their clothes. They were told to pile up their suitcases nicely, take their shoes, if there were laces, tie them together so they didn't get separated, take their clothes and lay them down nicely. And this way, when they came out of the shower, they'd find their things, and everything would be there waiting for them. So, you know, they went in, and they were naked, and they sealed the doors, and it was a concrete facility, and the gas called Zyklon B dropped through, and they were gassed. So then you have to wait until the gas dissipates. Then the prisoners had to go in there, and they had to pull the bodies out. And you get fillings in your teeth now, they're white. They had solid gold fillings back then. So the first thing they had to do was pry open people's jaws, and they had to pull out the gold, because the gold was sent back to Germany to fund Hitler's war machine. They had to shave everybody's heads because they stuffed pillows, they stuffed mattresses with the hair, because you know, comforters, that's what the Germans use for their comfort. And then they had to go through the clothes, because the women would, so in the hems, or the men had like cuffs on their pants, or they'd make a false waistband, and they'd sew like coins, a wedding band, anything they had that they thought they could hide so they could barter. And maybe they could get a piece of bread extra, anything. So they had to go through everything and take everything apart. And there were piles of gold rings, wedding rings, and you know, nothing was hidden. And then the bodies were piled on a cart, and the people, not horses, had to pull the cart and take them to the crematoriums, and they were burned. In the suitcases, so we light candles on Sabbath, so people had their Sabbath candles, candle holders, and they were sterling silver. So this was all very valuable to the Nazis, and was all sent back to Germany. So my dad, he was one of the 500, obviously, and he got in line, and they had them take all of their clothes off. And then they shaved them from head to toe, because if you had lice, lice would bring typhus into the camp, and if typhus broke out, everybody would start dying, and they wouldn't have a labor force. So they shaved them from head to toe, and then they gave them these striped pajamas and a little beanie hat, and in Auschwitz you got wooden shoes, just like the Dutch wear, that type of wooden shoe. And then you got your star, depending on what color, and then you got your prisoner number. So you'll see this after. And my dad's tattoo was 83988. He was the 83,988th person to enter Birkenau, and there was a triangle, half of a Jewish star underneath. That was the end of his identity. His name wasn't, it was Moshe Dach, but Morris Dash in the United States. But he had no identity anymore. He was just 83988, and that was it. So they took him and they sent them to the barracks. And when you went into the barracks every night, you were counted in, and the same amount of people had to come out. And if somebody somehow got out during the night and was unaccountable, you would all be murdered. So my dad was standing in line to go into the barracks, and he asked the guy next to him what happened to all the people that came in with him. And he pointed to the smokestack at the crematorium, and he goes, everybody's there. They're being burned. They're all going up in smoke. So my dad told me that he really didn't want to live after that. And he suggested to a German soldier that the soldier shoot him. And the soldier goes, not going to waste a bullet on you, because we're going to work you to death anyways, which is their exact intentions. That's why they kept bringing people from all over multiple countries, because they would starve everybody, and you know, they could only work so long, and then they'd be done with them, and they'd go to the gas chambers, or they would just die during the night, and they'd go to the crematoriums. So my dad went in, and there were anywhere from 3 to 6 people in a bunk, and the bunks were like, and I'll show you pictures after, were like wooden pallets. And there were no blankets, there were no pillows, and there was no body heat from the other people that were in the bunks with you, because they were all emaciated. I mean, you take a man, let's say, that's 200 pounds, and by the time they got done with this person, they were the Walking Dead. They were 60 pounds maybe. They worked them until they couldn't work anymore, and then they died. So, you know, they got into the bunks, and the next morning they went out and they went to work. So twice a day they were given rations. So they were given a piece of bread twice a day, and they were given a bowl of soup. And the soup was hot water with the potato peels, because the Germans got the potatoes. And that's all they were given twice a day, which is how the people were starved to death. So my dad was sent to school to be a bricklayer. And he was building the crematoriums, he was building the gas chambers, he was building the barracks, and he was at Birkenau, which was Auschwitz too. And the Germans wanted everything like really precise. And so he realized that if he like tilted the brick a little bit, they'd make him do it all over, and they'd send him back to school. So he got away with that for a little bit. And his brother that was there with him was doing the same thing. So they're building all of these facilities, and then one day, so Auschwitz was 3 main camps. There was Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, which was Birkenau, and that was the camp where the majority of the murders were done. And there was Auschwitz III, which was called Monowitz or Buna. And then there were like 2,000 subcamps that were all part of Auschwitz. So one day they sent my dad and his brother to Auschwitz III. And they were going to work in the Farben plant, the rubber plant there. And they thought, oh, this is like terrific, because maybe we'll get more food and the situation won't be as bad. So they get there and they see somebody from Plonsk, and the guy from Plonsk says, your 2 brothers are here, your older brothers. So it took 3 days, and my dad finally found them, and the 4 of them were together one last time. And the next day, typhus broke out, and they shipped my dad and the brother he had gone from Birkenau to Buna with back to Birkenau. And my dad never saw his brothers again. They were murdered at Buna. So my dad was doing that. Then they shipped him to one of the sub-camps called Yanina, and that was a coal mine. And so he worked in the coal mine. And they didn't give them any respirators or goggles or anything. So my dad had a good case of black lung disease, as we found out as I was growing up. And then he went back to Birkenau, and then he was at Auschwitz I building. And finally, the war was coming to an end. My uncle that was in the camp with him got dysentery. My father said, don't tell anybody. Just shut up and deal with it, basically. But he did, and so he did not survive. And so the Russians were coming upon Auschwitz, and they were coming to liberate the camp. And the Germans panicked because they were afraid of the Russians because of what went on in World War I. And the Germans started blowing up the crematoriums, they were blowing up the gas chambers, they were blowing up the barracks, because Hitler said the world will never know what happened, and he was trying to do away with any evidence of what went on in these camps. But they couldn't. I mean, the camps were miles and miles and miles. They couldn't blow things up fast enough. So they decided they were going to take the prisoners out on a death march. And they were going to march them out of Auschwitz, and they were going to march them 30 miles, put them on a train, and they were going to send them to other camps in Germany. It's January. Nobody has coats. Nobody has boots. Even the Germans had coats and boots and their guns, but they're with these people. There's no food. And they're marching them in this freezing cold and the snow through the forest, and they're going to go to these railroad tracks and get on another train. And my dad said people were dying left and right, including the soldiers, because the elements were terrible. And they couldn't. They didn't have enough body fat on them to make the trip. They were freezing, and the whole forest was just littered with dead and dying people. And on the third day, my father said he couldn't take it anymore, and he was going to run. And if they killed him, he was going to die anyways. And if they didn't, well, maybe somebody would find him. He didn't tell anybody he was going to run. He takes off running into the forest. Two guys follow him that he didn't know. And they shot at him, but nobody got hit. And so then they were wandering in the forest. They hid in barns. They broke into a farmhouse. The farmer was in the army. The farmer came back. He actually let them stay for a bit. And then he said the Germans were coming and he wasn't going to die because of them. So they had no idea where they were. They could have been in Moscow for all they knew. They didn't know if they were in Poland. They didn't know where they were. And so they're wandering and hiding. And finally the Russians find them. And the Russian soldiers said, you know, you're liberated, you're free. Here's guns, go out and shoot the Germans. Well, my dad wanted nothing to do with any guns. He'd seen enough people being murdered, and he did not want anything to do with any guns. He just wanted to know where he was, and he wanted to go back to Plonsk. And he knew everybody was dead. He intuitively, after being there, he was there 2 years and almost 3 months in Auschwitz. And but what if somebody came back? So they got him back to Plonsk, and he was there, and some of his friends that he grew up with, they came back. Couldn't get into his home, his parents' home. What happened was the Poles all confiscated all of the Jews' homes and all of their material objects, but he did manage to get into his uncle, my great uncle's home. And so they were all there, and there were 10 of them, and they had no idea what they were going to do with their lives. I mean, they're sitting here, they did not want to be in Poland, but where were they going to go? What were they going to do? What kind of education did they have? I mean, it's called the School of Hard Knocks. And what were they going to do with their lives? And a couple months went by, and they were, working and doing odd jobs, and there's a knock on the door, and it's the Polish army, and they had the audacity to tell these men that they're drafted into the Polish army. And my father took off, and he went to Lundsburg, Germany, and there was a DP, displaced persons camp there. So all of these survivors, they had no family or anything, so they went to these displaced persons camps. So they tried to find your family, tried to find people you might know. My dad wanted to go to Palestine and fight for what would become Israel. And they said, do you have any family anywhere? And my father said, oh, my mother had a brother and a sister that left in 1918 and went to Boston. And they said, well, that's where you're going to go then. We're going to find your relatives. You've got to go to your relatives. He goes, no, I want to go to what would be Israel. So my grandmother's last name was Shyman. And when her brother got to Ellis Island, he changed it to Simon, so to Americanize it. So it took 2.5 years to find the uncle. So finally they put my dad on a boat in Germany, and they send him over, and he hits New York Harbor, and he sees the Statue of Liberty, and everybody said to him, America is paved in gold. And he said it was the most horrible trip. Everybody was so sick. The ships didn't have any stabilizers. They wanted to die. If the Germans didn't kill them, they wanted to die on the trip going over. They were all so terribly ill. And they were packed. The ship was overpacked with people. And he lands, and it is March 17th, and it's St. Patrick's Day. Nobody in Poland had ever heard of St. Patrick's Day. He gets off, and his relatives are not there waiting for him from Boston. And they're gonna put him on a train to send him to Boston. He said he sees all these people in green, and they're drunk and acting crazy and eating green donuts. And he said, America, the streets are supposed to be paved with gold. It's supposed to be so wealthy. And he couldn't speak English, so he had no idea. I mean, I could only imagine what he was thinking. So they put him on a train, and he went to Boston, and Boston is even more Irish Catholic, and he encountered the same thing. And he got off the train, and these two women came up to him, and he could not speak English, but he could speak Yiddish, which is kind of a derivative of German, similar. And they asked him in Yiddish if it was him, and it was his two cousins, his uncle's daughters, and they took him to the house to his uncle. But the people came over, and you would think that the only survivor from your uncle's entire family, and the uncle, there were 8 siblings, and my grandfather had a huge family too, and hundreds of people were murdered, and you would think that, oh my gosh, you're here, this is so wonderful, we've got you. And they weren't excited at all. My uncle was happy to have him, but his wife didn't want a damaged person. And they didn't have a term PTSD back then. So, they just called him damaged, and his wife, my uncle had become very wealthy. He got into Boston politics, and he had all this real estate. And they had this huge house, which I had been in, and there were plenty of bedrooms. She put a mattress on a floor in a closet for my dad to sleep. So, and talking to other friends, their families were, they got the same welcome. Most people weren't standing there saying, here we are, come into our lives. So she sent my dad to work, the aunt, in a delicatessen downtown Boston by the State House to sweep floors, because that was all he was capable of doing. Because he was a kid. He was 18 when he went into the camps, and what kind of education did he have? And he can't do anything more than that. And so he was sweeping the floors. He was taking English classes, and then my uncle was buying some real estate, and he knew of this young man in Boston who was working in real estate and selling home improvements and all, and he took this guy named Herb with him to look at this piece of property. And they're riding, Herb's driving, and he's telling Herb about my father, his nephew. And so Herb said, I want to meet your nephew. So they meet, and they become best friends. And every morning, Herb picks my father up at the deli, and he works on the English with my father, and then he makes sales calls selling windows and doors and things like that. My dad sleeps a little bit, and my dad brings out a big bag of corned beef sandwiches for them. They all had to have bypass surgery because all of that. But, and they're riding around for like 6 months. And then one Friday night, Sabbath, he takes my father home. And he had there were 4 children in the family, 1 sister and 3 brothers. And the sister walks in, and my father looks at her, and they were married 3 months later. And Herb is my uncle. And he married my mother, Marion. And so when I think about it, my mother was first generation American. Her parents came from the Ukraine. And my grandpa, Glimsher, fought in World War I, actually, on horseback. And when you're younger, you just don't think about what your mother took on. You know your father went through the unimaginable. But my mother, that was a lot. And she was quite a woman. And it was a real love story. And so they were married for a while, and my mother got sick. And my father said, and had never missed a day of work, even if he was sick. And he said to the guy, I have to go to the hospital. My wife's in the hospital. Have to go. He goes, if you go, you're fired. My father's like, wait, I've been here all this time. I've never missed a day of work. He goes, I quit. So he left. He went to the hospital. He told my grandmother, my mom's mother, what went on. My grandmother said, well, then we're going to open your own deli for you. So they drove around different suburbs of Boston, and finally they came to right outside of Boston, just west. They came to a town called Natick, which was very up and coming, and they found a building, and they leased the building. And my dad said to his uncle, can I borrow $3,500 and for the equipment, and he said no. His wife wouldn't let him. And so my dad went to the bank in Natick, and the banker heard my dad's story, and the banker gave him a loan. And so he started his business, and he bought a house, started a new business, and I was born 2 weeks later. And 2 years after that, my brother was born. So, anybody that says they can't do something, you can do anything you put your mind to it. You think about Morris. Morris had religious education, no formal education like we were all lucky enough to get. I was so fortunate. I got to go to college. My brother got to go to college. My kids went to college. My father went to Auschwitz. And, he worked 7 days a week. He worked. He was the hardest working person you'd ever know. And, we grew up in Natick. Well, then we ended up in Ohio because Herb came out here to live because business was booming here with what he did. And his wife died at 32 and left 2 kids. And my father said to my mother, and a very close family, and said, we have to go out. We have to help your brother. He's left with these children. So that's how we ended up in Columbus, Ohio. But when I was a kid growing up, so every night, all night, my father would be either screaming or pacing the floors. And I'd come out of my room, Daddy, what are you doing? And he had quite the accent. I'm pasting the floors. Well, he couldn't sleep because the Germans were chasing him all night in his dreams. He never slept. The PTSD was so bad. But you know what? It didn't define him, and he did what he needed to do, and he made a terrific life for my brother and I and my mother, and he just did not let this. How much longer do I have?
45 minutes, about 5 minutes ago.
It was 45 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay, so I have till.
You got about 20-ish minutes.
20 minutes? Okay, good, thank you. So, I knew something was different. So there was a girl down the street, she was my best friend, her name was Barbara, and her father had a number and my father had a number. So I'm very much like my dad, and which really gave my mom a lot of heartache, but I go down the street and I said, what do you think the number is? I'm 7 years old. And she said, oh, my parents said it's our phone number. So I go running right back down the street and I look at my dad that night, and that's not our phone number. I know our phone number. It's not 83988. Right back down the street to the Burrell's house, and I said, better check that. That's not your phone number. Of course, my mother gets a call from the Burrells. So then right across from my dad's business in Natick Square was the library. So, and I love, to this day, I read constantly. So I go to the library, and I've got my little brother with me, and I said, you know, if somebody has a number on their arm, do you have a book? The woman gives me, the librarian, a book called Treblinka. Treblinka was another death camp. So I go home and I read this book. It was very inappropriate for a 7-year-old, by the way. But then I realized why I had family from my mother's side and why my dad had nobody. And so I kept reading, and I would put the books under my bed and hide them. And then one day my mother was cleaning up my mess, and she found all these books. And she called her mother, and my grandmother got in the car because she could handle me. And she came out to Natick, and she was sitting there when I came home from school with the books in her lap. And I said, uh-oh. And she goes, okay, you know, what do you want to know? And I said, and she gave me age-appropriate information, even though I had read information that was not age-appropriate. And, you know, I was afraid to ask my dad because I thought, well, maybe my dad didn't remember because you're young. And I was afraid to ask him anything because I might dredge up some bad memories and make him hurt. But I was always really, really protective of my father. And you know, I read more, and then my father finally spoke and told me, and in chunks, what happened, and as I became older. And so it always, even though, you know, I had my mom's family, I felt like half of me was missing. So I said to my dad, I want to go to Poland. You know, I have to see where we came from. I have to see our weeds. And we had like 5 visas canceled because Poland was still Russian then. And finally, we got to go to Poland in 1984. So, and it was under Russian control then. So it was my father, myself, my brother, my cousin Mark from New York City, and one of our dear friends, Paul from LA. He came on the trip. So we landed in Warsaw, and this is the monument where the Warsaw Ghetto was, and that was really at the beginning of the war, and that's all that's left. Let's see. There was one synagogue left in Warsaw. It was rebuilt by the Jews in the United States. Every year on the Hebrew anniversary of a person's death, we go to synagogue and we say a prayer, and you need 10 men to say this prayer. So my dad goes into the synagogue because my friend Paul, his father had passed, and it was his time to pray. And there was the caregiver there, and he said, it's called a minyan, we need a minyan, we need 10 men. And the guy's like, no. everybody's too afraid. In 1984, they were still afraid to come out. And we can't do it. So my dad gave him $20 and 10 men appeared. And so, you know, he could pray because, it's very important to us. It's part of who we are. So we could pray in that synagogue. Then we went to the cemetery in Warsaw. And the cemetery was actually, it was still standing, but it was so desecrated. So this was my dad. This was me with a very bad permanent. This is my brother Larry. This is my cousin Mark. And this is my friend Paul. And this is what the cemetery looked like. And we walked through there for hours and tried to stand up the stones. And I mean, it was left that way after the war, but her kids and her husband and my kids, they all went on this trip called the March of the Living, where they spent a week in Poland during Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance. And then the second week they're in Israel for Israel's Soldiers' Remembrance, and then the birthday of Israel. So they go from despair to joy in the streets. So they had redone this, the Americans came and they fixed up the cemetery, and there were 15,000 kids from all over the world on this trip. And my son and the kids from Bexley, where we live, and the group from Cleveland that they were with, they're walking into the cemetery, and they have an Israeli soldier and a Polish soldier with them, because everybody had to be guarded at all times. And this woman starts screaming in Polish, and the soldier said, she was screaming, "We thought we killed you all, why do you come back?" And Aaron's calling me hysterical from Poland. I mean, you know, you just want to go and be there, and yes, so, whoop, wrong way. And in Plonsk, this is where they had to go every day to get their water. My dad had to take a bucket and walk out. If you remember, I said no running water. So that was in Plonsk Square. This is where the cemetery was. They put a monument up saying this is where the cemetery was. So this is where my great-grandparents and whole family was buried, but nothing there anymore. What did I do? Okay. This is what the houses looked like. And they were still riding in '84 with the horses and buggies, and there weren't very many automobiles. This is a picture I took at a woman's house of Plonsk Square. And it was a bustling town. This was before the war. That's where you just saw the pump. That was one of the synagogues. There were two giant synagogues there. They don't exist. Oops. This is what the rail car looked like. Now they've cleaned them up. When you see pictures, they look very pristine. And the grass is cut, and they painted them, and they don't look like this now. This is Treblinka. Now there are more monuments there, but Treblinka, the whole camp was destroyed. The Germans managed to blow that whole camp up, and it was a death camp. And these were just mass graves. This was at Majdanek. Majdanek is in the center of a big town called Lublin in Poland, where if you I stood looking in Lublin downtown. I stood looking at the railroad tracks, and I could see the towers at Majdanek. And you have to think, they said, We didn't know what was going on. Well, trainloads of people are going in and nobody's coming back out on the trains. And the smoke is coming out every day. So the whole barracks was full of hats. You walk through this narrow area and it was just hats. And then one area was the striped pajamas. And then there were shoes. Nothing but shoes. And by the time Paul and I walked out of there, we had to throw up at the end. It was, and they all belonged to people that didn't survive. And that's the Zyklon B that gassed them. This is in barracks in Birkenau. This is how the people slept. When you see the tracks now, they're all clean, but that's what it looked like back in 1984. Now it's monuments and exhibits. This is one of the crematoriums at Birkenau that was bombed. Because of course the world would not know. And that's a table that the doctors did medical experiments on. Dr. Mengele was the infamous doctor. And physicians are supposed to do no harm. They take an oath. But people would run up against these electric fences just to kill themselves. And they were everywhere. And then you could see the towers, the watchtowers. And those were Polish soldiers that my father decided he was going to lead the tour for, because he could speak Polish and they weren't hearing the right story. So he said we knew what we were looking at, and he took over the tour he took over the tour wherever he went. That was my dad. And this is Birkenau. This is what you see when you see Auschwitz, the pictures. But now it's all mowed and everything. And these were the train tracks. And when they drove through the other side, that's where they went for selection. Who was going to live and who was going to die. And that's Larry and Dad and I in front of the crematorium. No. My dad's number. And they had guards in every one of those. So if somebody was trying to escape or anything, they were immediately shot. That's how they slept. This was the latrine. They had a fireplace in there, but they never put anything in there to light it, so they could be warm. Can you imagine 6 people in one of those little cubicles? We couldn't survive. That's one of the carts that they would take them to the crematoriums. Whoops. That's the gas chamber. And that's my dad in front of the crematorium. And they couldn't burn the bodies fast enough. That was the whole problem. And those are the gates that he came through. Arbeit macht frei, work makes freedom. And until we landed there and started walking through, stupid me didn't realize the enormity of taking him back through those gates. And that was one of the blocks he was in. And that was where they had a firing range. This was where the coal mine was in Jena. So a photographer came through Poland. Nobody had cameras. And my grandfather and my oldest uncle were in Warsaw. And so this is my grandmother Dvora. I'm named after her. This is my uncle Shopsa, my father, and my uncle Toybeh. And I don't know what my grandfather or my uncle Simcha looked like. No pictures. And Hitler didn't kill us. We survived. My niece Nicole, my nephew Jacob, my oldest son Scott, my niece Emily, and my younger son Aaron. So, and my dad lived to see all of them. So I'm very blessed. And we made it.